Investment proposal, draft. The name on the draft? Jonah Ellison. Her friend. A registered financial advisor. One she once introduced to me at a benefit dinner with a quick, "Jonah's harmless. Total numbers guy, not even my type." She laughed when she said it. I remembered that laugh when I read the attached notes. Phrases like, probable equity shift opportunity, and targeted ownership reallocation, jumped off the screen. But what made my chest tighten was a single line, buried in a spreadsheet footer. Projected full control by Q4, pending compliance cooperation. Full control. Of the house. Of the trust. Of everything. This wasn't a separation. It was liquidation. She wasn't breaking down a relationship. She was stripping assets like a corporate raider. The second accountant found a shell LLC tied to Jonah's advisory firm. Buried in Nevada records, one layer deep under her maiden name. Its listed purpose was vague. Consulting. It held $84,000, transferred gradually. From our accounts. I stared at that number for a long time. Not because of the amount, but because I remembered how she used to stop me from ordering dessert when we went out. "Let's be smart," she'd say. "Let's think long term." Now I knew what she meant by smart, and I knew exactly whose long term she'd been planning. But I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I gathered, logged, printed, stored hard copies offsite, backed up every digital file twice, created a master file labeled Distribution Strategy, Marital, and I smiled when I saved it. Not because it felt good, because it felt necessary. 3 weeks after I started the audit, the title report on our house changed. Not publicly. Not in a way most people would notice. But I had a daily ping set up through a private asset monitoring service, and on a cold Tuesday morning, I got an alert: fractional ownership had shifted again. 2%. Just enough to be overlooked, but not by someone watching for it. The transfer had come from a trust one hadn't seen before. A sub-entity under our marital trust, something she'd created using a carve-out clause buried in an old estate planning document we'd signed in 2017. At the time, it was pitched as flexibility for emergency disbursement. I remember her nodding as the attorney explained it. I didn't question it. I was looking at the future. She was already looking for exits. Now she was using it to bleed equity from our home, slowly, methodically, into a trust registered under her maiden name. The trustee? Jonah. I didn't need to guess anymore. I met with Landry in a nondescript office tower across town. He was a recommendation from one of the forensic accountants, someone who specialized in asset defense before divorce proceedings. He looked like a man who ironed his socks. Calculated, quiet, exactly what I needed. I laid out everything I'd found. He listened without interrupting, taking notes with a mechanical pencil. When I finished, he asked only one question. "Do you want to catch her?" I didn't flinch. "I already have." He nodded once, then slid a folder across the table. "Then it's time to prepare the counterweight." That day, we began assembling the motion to challenge her transfers. I gave him power of attorney over all real estate-related holdings, which allowed him to quietly prepare a motion to dissolve the sub-trust she'd been abusing. But that wasn't the end. One of the accountants called me late that Friday. He'd found a scan filed digitally through a legal document service, one of those cheap e-signature platforms. It claimed she had inherited partial control of the marital trust due to documented duress. I didn't understand what that meant at first. Then I saw the attachment. My signature. It was real. I recognized the curve of the J in my name, the slight rightward lean. But it wasn't recent. It had been lifted from a scanned copy of a 7-year-old lease agreement, one we'd signed when we rented a cabin for her sister's wedding. It had been filed under a different context, a different purpose. She'd repurposed it, attached it to a new document, and filed it in a digital-only courthouse portal in a county we'd never lived in. That wasn't a mistake. That was strategy. Badly executed. Sloppy. But strategic. She was gambling on procedural volume, filing late, filing wrong, hoping I wouldn't see it until it was too late to challenge. But I already had the timestamp. She didn't know I had dissolved the trust, legally, cleanly, 11 months earlier, with full sign-off and legal separation of assets into a protected family foundation. That was the move she hadn't seen coming. While she'd been building her scheme one paper cut at a time, I'd already closed the vein. But I didn't tell her. Not yet. Instead, I waited. Not out of cruelty. Not even for dramatic effect. I waited because when you're watching someone play a rigged game, the most satisfying thing isn't calling them out. It's letting them think they're winning, right up until they can't cash the prize. She served me papers on a Thursday, mid-morning. The courier was polite, looked a little uncomfortable. He handed over the envelope like it might explode in his hands. Inside, her motion was bold. She was requesting primary ownership of the home, citing her documented financial contributions, her emotional investment, and most curiously, her stewardship during transition. That last part made me pause. Stewardship. As if she'd been protecting the house while I wandered off like some absent-minded landlord. The filing was accompanied by documents, half real, half invented, claiming that her financial advisor, Jonah, had helped her restructure obligations in anticipation of our divorce. It was framed to sound like she was the practical one, the responsible one, the one trying to make things easy. There was no mention of the transfers, no acknowledgement of the Shell LLC, and certainly no disclosure of the forged signature filing she had attempted 3 weeks prior. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Landry filed a quiet countermotion 2 days later, motion to dismiss property claim on grounds of prior trust dissolution. We didn't deliver it to her yet. We waited. Timing mattered. That following Monday, she scheduled a mediation session, said she wanted to cut through the mess, said she was willing to be fair, if I'd be reasonable. I showed up exactly on time. She was already seated when I walked in, chatting with her attorney like they were planning brunch. Her eyes flicked up when she saw me. Calm, confident. She wore a blazer she used to save for board meetings, the kind with padded shoulders and sharp lapels. She smiled faintly, like a teacher giving a difficult student one more chance to turn in the homework. She opened the meeting with what she probably thought was magnanimity. "I'm willing to let you keep the equity in the lake property," she said. "In exchange, I keep the house." No mention of the trust. No mention of Jonah. She wanted to play it like this was all civilized, like it was some adult decision between two grown people who just drifted. I watched her posture. I knew that look. It was the same one she gave waiters when they messed up her order, smiling, polite, but laced with condescension. Landry waited for her to finish. Then he opened the folder again. Same one as before. He slid it forward page by page. First, the trust formation. Then, the full dissolution documents. Finally, a notarized affidavit from our accountant, verifying the trust had been closed and all property transferred to an irrevocable foundation. She looked down at the papers, then back up. There was a flicker then. Just a trace of something behind her eyes. Not panic. Not yet, but confusion. She reached for the documents, but Landry's voice stopped her. "These have been in place for over a year," he said evenly. "The property is no longer in your client's claimable marital estate. The motion to dismiss is filed and pending." Her lawyer blinked. This isn't what we were told. We have filings. You have incomplete filings," Landry replied, folding his hands. "Filed in the wrong county. Under invalid assumptions. Using a signature tied to an unrelated lease document from 2017. The room went quiet. She didn't speak. She didn't look at me. I didn't offer a word. I only waited, because now, there was nothing else to say. The trap had closed, and she knew it. She left the mediation room without looking back. Not angrily, just hollow. Like the part of her that had smirked 3 weeks ago was no longer there. Her attorney followed a few steps behind, already on the phone. I watched them through the glass, her figure shrinking with every step. It wasn't victory I felt. It was confirmation. I hadn't misread anything. She hadn't slipped into this. She hadn't stumbled. She'd walked into it with both eyes open and a calculator in her hand. 3 days later, I got the alert. The financial advisor, Jonah, had his license formally suspended. The forensic report we submitted, paired with the court filings, was enough for the board to act quickly. They cited ethics violations, unauthorized asset transfers, and failure to disclose conflict of interest. In other words, he played too close to the fire. The Shell LLC registered under her maiden name had been frozen, not because I demanded it. Because she'd made a critical mistake, she filed a transfer to it from our joint account while claiming to be unaware of its existence. You can't play innocent while wearing the fingerprints. Her attorney withdrew the following Monday. Conflict of interest. I'd seen it coming. Once the fraudulent document was part of the court record, no reputable firm wanted to be tied to it. She tried to file a counter-motion on her own, 3 pages, sloppy margins, handwritten corrections, but it was denied before it even hit the docket. Then the audit notice landed. Not from me. From the IRS. Her trust activity, the shell entity, and Jonah's financial involvement triggered a full review of the last 3 years of her filings. She emailed me about it, once. The message was short. "You didn't have to escalate this." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Then I typed, "You shouldn't have repurposed my signature without consent." I never heard back. She tried to refile with a new attorney 2 weeks later. Someone from out of state. Young, probably cheap, maybe desperate. The man wouldn't look me in the eye during the preliminary meeting. He'd clearly been brought up to speed and didn't want to be part of it. They didn't file anything new after that. What I didn't expect, what landed with more weight than any filing or courtroom victory, were the messages. Not to me. To Jonah. Extracted from her cloud backup. Quietly, legally, fully admissible. She wasn't in love with him. She wasn't even pretending to be. It was arithmetic. "Once the house is in my name, he'll fold. The trust is the only variable. If he's dumb, I'm rich." She wasn't planning a future. She was counting on a formula. Cold. Efficient. Like an equation where I was the only one unaware I'd been plugged in long ago. For months, I'd asked myself what I'd missed. What signs had slipped past me? The late nights. The quiet withdrawals. The sudden urge to simplify our finances. But it was never about the signs. It was about the story she was writing without me. A version of herself that came out the other side with everything cleanly transferred and none of the mess. She thought she could calculate her way through betrayal. But some equations don't balance. And now, all her variables were crashing. She was served at exactly 11 a.m. Landry made sure of it. The process server handed her the packet just as she stepped out of her car at Jonah's office. She was caught between the sidewalk and the tinted glass door, nowhere to run without making it worse. Motion to dismiss her property claim. Motion to challenge the attempt to alter trust ownership improperly. Emergency filings citing irregular filings and unauthorized attempts to transfer assets. I didn't attend that delivery. There was no need. Everything that mattered had already been set in motion. And besides, I knew what was in the file. The timestamp was on the first page. The trust had been legally dissolved exactly 1 year earlier. 12 months. 365 days. A full calendar between her first consultation with Jonah and the moment she realized the assets she'd been trying to bleed dry no longer existed in the way she thought they did. The foundation I'd created had absorbed every piece. The house, the lake property, the equity she thought was still in play. She hadn't lost the battle. She'd walked onto a battlefield that had already been abandoned. When we returned to mediation later that week, she looked changed. Not humiliated. Not openly. She still wore her uniform. Structured jacket, smooth hair, pale lipstick. But the posture was different. Less control, more containment. Landry laid out the record. The dissolution. The foundational restructuring. The misfiled trust claims. And finally, the unauthorized use of my signature on an unrelated document, tied to a completely unrelated document. Her lawyer, this new one, a quiet woman with sharp eyes and a visibly fraying briefcase, kept glancing at her. But she didn't interrupt. No one did. When Landry finished, I watched my ex-wife carefully. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, "You dissolved it without telling me." It wasn't a question. I let the silence stretch before I answered. "You were already planning your exit. You just didn't know I was planning mine." She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her hands were still on the table, knuckles pale, fingers unmoving. "I would have been fair," she said softer now. I nodded, slowly. "You would have been careful. Not fair." Her lawyer tried to interject, some brief mention of interpretations and intent, but Landry didn't even look at her. "The court record stands," he said flat. "This isn't about interpretation. This is about attempted control through misrepresentation." No one argued. Because there was nothing left to say. She sat back in her chair, and for the first time in months, I saw something behind her eyes that wasn't calculation. It was loss, not of me, of the plan. And that, I think, was the first moment she truly realized it was over. Not just the marriage, not just the house, but the version of her future that she'd quietly, methodically built on a series of lies and partial truths. That version had just collapsed, and there would be no rebuilding it from here. When the formal court decision landed, it was only 3 paragraphs long. Concise, unemotional, direct. Her property claim was denied. The trust manipulation challenge was validated. The transfer filings she'd made, each one carefully stacked like poker chips, were labeled non-binding, unsubstantiated, and procedurally invalid. The judge didn't need dramatic language. The paperwork spoke for itself. She never made another formal claim on the house. Because the house wasn't hers. It hadn't been hers in over a year. I'd moved it, silently, into the foundation. The entity held no beneficiaries. Only directives, educational support for my niece, grants to a regional arts program, housing support for a former mentor of mine from college. The foundation wasn't for me. It was my way of ending the cycle she tried to weaponize, this endless calculation of who owns what, who deserves more, who. 1. Her attorney reached out once more, politely requesting a private settlement discussion. Outside of court parameters, we declined. There was nothing left to negotiate. In court, she sat beside that same tired lawyer, no makeup this time, her posture looser, more unguarded. She didn't look at me. She stared at the floor. When the ruling was read, I didn't watch her. I watched the clerk, watched the rhythm of protocol unfold, stamped documents, quiet shuffling of folders, the murmured acknowledgement of procedural closure. She stood before I did. And then, for the first time, she followed me. In the hallway outside the courtroom, she caught up, matching my pace for a few steps. "We could have split it fairly," she said. I didn't slow down. "You tried to steal it." Her voice dropped, maybe trying to reclaim softness. I was scared. I stopped at the end of the hall, turned to face her. "No," I said, keeping my tone level. "You were calculating. Scared people panic. You strategized." She opened her mouth, but whatever came next, excuse, apology, plea, it never made it out. I pushed the exit door open, let the heavy metal frame swing wide. The air outside was sharp, bright, too clean. I didn't look back. I never saw her again, not in court, not in mediation, not on the street, not in passing. The house she'd planned to quietly claim is still in the foundation. I don't live there anymore. I walked through it one last time before the transfer formalized, room by room. Not with sadness, with clarity. I touched the banisters she once joked about refinishing. Stood in the kitchen where she'd suggested we go, paperless, with finances, and in the bedroom where she'd kept her phone just far enough from reach during dinner conversations. I opened the closet, then closed it. There was nothing I needed to pack, because everything I'd needed to reclaim, I already had. There were no headlines, no dramatic courtroom reversals, no one screaming through lawyers or calling news outlets. But the unraveling was total, and it happened quietly, deliberately, in the spaces between documents and decisions. The IRS audit letter came 2 weeks after the ruling. She had claimed deductions she wasn't entitled to, funneled consulting payments to the shell entity, and reported trust-related income that never legally existed. It wasn't just messy, it was suspicious. Jonah's financial license was formally revoked 3 days later. The board's statement cited gross negligence, improper handling of client-related trust assets, and failure to disclose fiduciary conflict. In plain language, he used his position to help her stage a financial ambush. Their relationship didn't survive it. The messages stopped. The digital trail that had pulsed with strategic plans and financial games went dead. No new activity, no filings, no signatures. Just 2 people, each carrying the weight of a shared miscalculation. And her name? Flagged. The court record followed her. Attempted unauthorized transfers, signature discrepancies, a judge's note regarding credibility concerns. Those words mattered more than she understood. Because from that point forward, no reputable law firm in our city would represent her. They didn't want the risk. Her last attorney withdrew mid-case. The one after that didn't show up to a scheduled hearing. She began representing herself, fumbling through filings, missing deadlines, asking the court for extensions. But there were no victories left to win. I didn't celebrate. There was no joy in watching someone's narrative slowly fall apart. But I didn't interfere either. Not when her bank froze her business account. Not when the online reviews for her small marketing consultancy started referencing legal issues and trust problems. Not when mutual acquaintances stopped returning her calls. She tried once, just once, to reach out again. Not through court. Not through lawyers. A handwritten note, delivered to my office by courier. no return address. All it said was, "You got everything. Was that the plan all along?" I didn't reply, because what she still didn't understand was that I hadn't wanted everything. I wanted safety, stability, trust. She had confused silence with weakness, caution with ignorance. She thought because I didn't rage I didn't know. But I'd known, and I'd acted. Strategically, quietly, completely. The fallout wasn't loud. It didn't come with headlines or handcuffs. It came with closed doors, empty inboxes, and the slow erosion of credibility. She didn't just lose the house. She lost the story she'd built about herself. The smart one. The planner. The architect of her next chapter. But blueprints built on stolen signatures don't hold weight. They collapse. Just like she did. She never figured it out. Even after the court losses, even after the filings collapsed and Jonah's name disappeared from advisory records, she never truly understood what had happened to the assets. Not entirely. She thought the house was the prize, the centerpiece, the leverage. But the house had been gone long before she ever tried to claim it. 12 months before she initiated her first covert transfer, I'd sat with an estate strategist. Not because I suspected betrayal. Back then, I just wanted long-term security, something airtight in case of legal uncertainty or business liability. We designed a quiet structure, an irrevocable family foundation. Not flashy, not tied to my name publicly. A separate board, legally isolated, layered with institutional compliance. It wasn't built to hide money. It was built to protect it. So when she came for the trust, thinking she could bleed percentages from within, using a borrowed advisor and a frayed legal map, she never realized the territory had already been ceded. She was fighting over an empty vault. I dissolved the original trust 6 weeks after it was rebalanced, transferred all core assets, properties, equity, the passive revenue she used to cite during tax meetings, each document dated, notarized, certified, every signature real, every move legal. That was the part that landed the final blow, not the confrontation, not the court filings, but the realization that even if she had filed everything correctly, even if she hadn't forged a document, it still wouldn't have mattered. The account she built her betrayal on? It didn't exist. Not anymore. When Landry delivered that line in mediation, that account closed last year. She didn't react right away. She blinked once, maybe twice. But the impact wasn't theatrical. It was surgical. Because in that moment, every late-night call, every message to Jonah, every carefully timed financial maneuver became meaningless. The playbook she'd built, the scripts she'd rehearsed, all collapsed under the weight of a single fact. She was too late. All her moves were checkers, and we were playing chess. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt finished. I had built something she couldn't touch, not out of revenge, but resilience. And when I walked out of that final meeting, I didn't feel like I'd won. I felt like I'd walked away from a quiet wreck with everything still intact. Not because I wasn't singed, but because I'd seen the fire coming, and moved everything that mattered before the flames ever reached it. The irony was, she never wanted me gone. Not really. She wanted me neutralized, still present enough to project civility, to play the part of the cooperative ex, but too dulled by confusion to realize the game being played behind my back. That was always her flaw. She never saw the full consequences, just the short-term position. A move that gave her leverage, a filing that made me look reactive. She played for inches and assumed the yards would follow. But betrayal isn't a static event. It's a shifting pattern, revealed only when you look from the right distance. Once I stepped far enough back, the full picture snapped into place. Jonah wasn't the origin. He was a tool. Efficient, educated, reckless in the way that men become when they mistake intelligence for invincibility. He saw my caution as absence, my trust as ignorance. That made him easy to beat. What disturbed me more was how easily she slipped into the role of planner. Not because she had some grand vision, but because she didn't flinch. There was no hesitance in the emails we recovered. No hint of doubt. Just transaction after transaction, each one stripped of emotion. This one won't notice. He's too passive. Once the title swings, we control the equity. Control. Equity. Title. Not once did she refer to me by name in those messages. I wasn't a person. I was an obstacle. So I became a strategist. I hired a secondary firm to audit her filings for the last 3 years. Not out of pettiness, but because she had used our shared tax structure to reroute personal gains. I didn't leak it to anyone. I didn't even tell Landry until the findings came in. Multiple undeclared deposits, undocumented consulting fees paid through Jonah's shell firm, charitable deductions listed under the same trust she claimed no control over. By the time the IRS arrived at her door, I wasn't even monitoring anymore. I didn't need to, because she was unraveling faster than I could track. It didn't happen in some dramatic spiral. It happened in missed court dates, in frozen business accounts, in colleagues who suddenly weren't available for meetings. It happened in the silence that followed her name after someone asked, "Do you know what happened with?" She didn't just lose credibility. She lost the ledger she'd built her identity on. And I didn't have to take it. She gave it away, by building it on borrowed names and forged pages. All I did was write the last entry, and close the book. The silence that followed wasn't loud. It was surgical. No angry calls, no last-minute filings, no emails begging for reconsideration. Just absence. For a while, I expected her to pivot, to attempt some reinvention. A new business name, a different city, a carefully worded explanation for why her consulting firm folded, why the IRS pulled her records, why her advisor's license vanished overnight. But nothing came. I checked once, curiosity more than concern, and found a hollow trail. Her business website was offline. The LLC had been marked inactive. Her personal accounts, once curated down to the exact aesthetic, hadn't posted in months. Even Jonah had disappeared from professional directories. She'd gambled on a quiet heist and ended up with public consequences. That's what stuck with her. Not the loss. The exposure. She used to tell me that perception was half the economy. That people didn't care if you were qualified. They cared if you looked in control. It was a line she used when we'd go over presentations, when she'd plan client pitches, when she'd post from hotel bars with a laptop positioned just right in frame. Now, there was no performance left to stage. No house to walk through with a glass of wine, no office to feature in a story captioned, "Building something real." She was off the grid, and I didn't chase. Because the goal had never been to break her down. It had been to protect what mattered. The house, the trust, the assets, they weren't trophies. They were lines in the sand, things that should have been untouchable between people who built a life together. But she'd crossed that line, and so I'd drawn a new one. I stayed in the foundation's guest property for a while. Clean space. Quiet. Nothing grand, but nothing shared either. I rebuilt from there. Not emotionally, not all at once, but practically. New accountant. New legal structure. A firewall around every account I touched. And slowly, the anxiety I'd carried for months, waiting for the next twist, the next scheme, started to dull. Not disappear, but dull. Sometimes I'd still replay her voice in my head. "We could have split it fairly." And then I'd remember her emails. "Once the house is in my name, he'll fold." That wasn't someone looking for fairness. That was someone trying to rob me quietly, behind the mask of civility. I didn't hate her, but I no longer carried the burden of pretending she was who I thought she was. That, more than anything, was freedom.